Welcome to the first in the new series, the Contemplation Conversations, hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Jacinta Parsons. I'm going to be your moderator for today, and I am so delighted to be hosting this important event in association with the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences for their 75th anniversary, and they don't look a day over 21. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians present. Today, we are exploring how people all over the world are struggling to process their emotions about climate change and the effect that that has on our lives. How we deal with climate change on top of pandemics, war, and inequity. Can contemplative practices from Indigenous, Buddhist, and other traditions support us to care for the earth, our communities, and ourselves? And what does the latest research say about which interventions work and when? I'm very excited to have you involved in this conversation today as well. But to start with, I'd like to welcome Uncle Tony Garvey to welcome us to country.
Thank you very much, Jacinta, for that warm welcome. I'd just like to start off my welcome to country with saying Wurminjika to everyone. So Wurminjika in the Wurundjeri language means welcome. So welcome to all Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here today. Also, just like to say I'm very proud and honoured to be here representing my people, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people from the Yarra out at Healesville. My great-grandfather was the last Nurrungita that lived at Corrindurk on the land when it was opened. Nurrungita means the last head tribesman. So he was the last head tribesman after King Barak. My uncle, my mum's brother, was the last born on Corrindurk in the 1930s. The mission is now reopened. The Wurundjeri people were also a part of the Kulin Nation. So Kulin means man. And in the Kulin Nation, there were the 5 language groups. There was the Wadawurrung to the west, the Coorong, who were the westerly neighbours to the Wadawurrung, Tanarong to the northeast, Bunurong to the southwest, and the Wurrung of the Wurundjeri territory that we stand on here today. Wurundjeri lies in the inner cities of Melbourne. It extends to the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, south to the Yarra River, west to the Werribee River, and east to Mount Baw. The Wurundjeri people, they have a social totem. It is Bunjil the eagle. Bunjil represents spiritual powers throughout many parts of Australia. Bunjil taught all the laws about life, behaviour and ceremonies to make sure that our culture would continue for all walks of life throughout Australia. Bunjil is referred to as the creator of mankind. Bunjil created great people from the land, and that is why we call the land our mother, or the mother of creation. Never can the land be taken away. The land will always belong to Aboriginal people, as we are part of the land and the land is part of us. Our story is similar to yours. Yours is by your chosen faith, ours is by the dream time. We both have creators and beliefs, and ours is Bunjil. It is a traditional custom of the Australian Aboriginal communities to be asked and to give permission for people to enter their land. And today you have now joined with me to honour the spirits of my ancestors, past, present and merging, who have nurtured this land for over 60,000 years. And we as the custodians of the land offer a heartily welcome to the land and hope that together as citizens of this beautiful country, we can build, develop and unite stronger nations for all people. And finally, I'd just like to close in my Wurrung language, which is Wurminjika, Wandun, Wurundjeri, Balak, Yemen, Kumbibik, which means is the most welcome to the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Thank you very much for inviting us here today.
Tony, the thanks goes directly back to you. Thank you so much for your welcome. Now, I'm also delighted to be joined by 4 wonderful panelists. I guess, I don't know, are you going to wave, do a dance when I introduce you? Or if you're cool like Jamie, you just like, keep it real. Professor Catherine Williams is a professor, there she is, of environmental psychology at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences, the University of Melbourne. Catherine enjoys exploring how people feel, think and act toward plants, animals and physical environments, and what this means for environmental conservation and decision making. Now this was like I'm doing like perfect match or something. So we've had our first contestant. Our second is Dr. Katie Greenway, a senior lecturer and research fellow at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, the University of Melbourne. Katie is lead researcher on a research project aimed at providing a definitive account of eco-anxiety as a specific psychological phenomenon that operates at clinical and subclinical levels, and to identify methods of managing eco-anxiety by building individual and social resilience. Thank you, Katie. Tejapala Rolls, there he is, Yop. He's a climate activist, ordained Buddhist, stand-up comedian, I love those 2 bits that come together in your CV, and community organiser for the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, which is a grassroots multi-faith organisation that organises faith communities to advocate for action on climate change. He grew up in New Zealand, so obviously he's an Australian and is a member of the Triratna, is that how we say that, Tejapala, Buddhist order. He's passionate about both change in the world and the transformation of the mind and the relationship between the two. And Jamie Marlu Thomas is a Gunai Kurnai man and co-founder of Wayapa Work. Jamie is a conduit for knowledge from his elders to the next generation. He understands the pain of disconnection from country, which is why he is devoted to reconnecting people back to their responsibility for caring for the planet. We are thrilled to have Jamie set the scene for us today with a brief introduction to the practice of Wayapa Work. Welcome, Jamie.
Thanks, Jacinta. I'm so pumped to be here, guys. And in absolute esteemed presence, thank you, Tony, for setting the scene with that welcome to Dilly, my brother. I want to also honour Mother Earth. Little bowl here that I light. It's just a little ceremonial bowl that I like to light before a yarn because it's about honouring our ancestors. It's about honouring our ancestors that for hundreds of thousands of years on the planet as humans, we sat around fire far longer than when we sat around the TV watching Netflix. And we observed and we shared stories of connection. We were ancient hunters and gatherers. So I want to pay respects to Mother Earth for all that she provides for us and give gratitude for our fellow species, the plants, the animals. And I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, quick way, of connection from my perspective. So I co-created Wayapa with the amazing Sarah Jones. And what it is really is just a remembering of who we are as humans, of connection to the environment, of responsibility, of respecting the environment. You see, because Mother Earth doesn't need looking after. She can look after herself. We just need to respect her in our daily ways. So through meditation, so I'm going to take a quick little journey in a minute. There is an embodiment practice that we don't have time for today to get bendy like licorice and embody physically Wayapa. But really what it's about is about sustainability. It is about how we, as that single drop in the ocean, how we can make difference. And one of my elders, Uncle Mugi Sumner, he told me this story. He said, Jamie, we are all humans. We are all connected to the planet. Just some of us have forgotten that relationship, and just some of us have forgotten that responsibility of respecting Mother Earth. Imagine if 8 billion people just were mindful of looking after their special environment, how amazing it would be. So if we had that tipping point Three people here living the best life of looking after the country, looking after the planet. 8 billion people here. I only need to get them here for the change to happen. So Wayapa is my grandmother's language, which means to join or connect. Work is a Gunai word, which means if I can get people reconnected back to their special place, if 8 billion people could look after their special place, all of our places will be looked after. So quickly, what we're going to do is get comfortable. I'm going to take you through a quick guided visualization. Please, if you feel safe enough to do so, you feel comfortable enough to do so, I want you to close your eyes. And we're going to go deep. We're going to go deep into connection through whole of sensory connectivity. So with your visualization, what can you see? Where's your special place? Where do you love to go? Where do you love to go and sit and take up nature? What is your relationship visually with that special place? What can you hear there? What are those sounds? Wind, rain, animals. What can you smell? Is it the dry, minerally desert? Is it the beautiful rainforest, flowers, ocean? What can you feel? And not just physically feel. Yes, it might be warm, might be windy, might be wet, might be snowing. But energetically, what is flowing up through your feet, through your body? Whole of sensory connectivity. We talked before about the creation, the creator. What is your concept of it? You could be Christian, could be Muslim, could be spiritualist. What is your concept of creation? What formed the world that we have? From the stars to the water to the minerals in the earth. The sun. We all share the same sun. It is the same sun all humans experience. The cycles of the sun, the equinoxes, the solstices that create the seasons. The longest days, the shortest nights, connecting into that sun. The third element of Wayapa is the moon, connecting into the moon cycle. How much it affects us. It affects all the water on the planet, that waxing moon, that new moon, the full moon, the waning moon. 27, 28-day cycle of the moon connects us. That landscape in which I asked you to sit on, the rivers, the mountains, the valleys, the deserts, the billions of years of shifting tectonic plates and volcanoes erupting under our feet, creating that landscape. We move from Mother Earth into her elements, the lightning. Her elements can be so beneficial, but also so destructive. Inner cloud lightning, energy of that inner cloud, sheet lightning, energy from cloud to cloud, the cloud to that chain lightning that creates the nitrate, the splitting of that nitrogen, that sound of the splitting of that nitrogen, thunder. Honoring the cloud to ground lightning, that fork or bolt lightning that starts the fires. Our ancestors, they learned that. They learned the importance of fire. Because for billions of years, fire has been a part of Mother Earth's makeup. How our ancestors mastered and learnt how to use fire for cooking, for warmth, for ceremony, for caring for country. That fire stick farming. honoring the next element, the rain. Rain is literally the evaporation of water off the surface of Mother Earth up into the sky and falling down. This process, this 3.5 billion year old process of evaporation and falling of water, forming rain from the west, from the south, from the east, from the north. The wind, Mother Earth's other tool, the mover of rain, of clouds, of energy, picking up nutrients from the earth, grabbing that seed from that tree, blowing it across the surface, becoming that plant, that tree. The 8 elements visualize growing in 2 directions. Through your feet, which are the roots, your body, which is the trunk, your arms, the branches, your fingers, the leaves. Take a nice big deep breath in and out. Our carbon dioxide is that energy of that tree. We transition to the air animal, honoring that we share this world with things that fly. Are you Bunjil, the eagle? Are you the butterfly? Are you that bat? Are you that ladybird? But if you could fly high up and look at your special place from the perspective of that air animal, you will see how everything is connected. Where you are today on Wurundjeri country is connected where I am on Gunai country, is connected where the Māori people or the Native American people or the African people, everywhere is connected. Come down to the land. We honor the land animal. It could be the kangaroo, the deer, could be the lion. We honor that we share this world with animals that live on the land. And then we connect to the water animal. It could be the mightiest of the blue whales, to the smallest of plankton, to the turtles, the dolphins, the eels, the fish that live in the freshwater, the saltwater, the lakes, the rivers, the streams, the oceans. Waiapa honors our ancient ancestors. At some point in time, your ancestors, they lived like my ancestors, connected, respectful of the environment. It might be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago that your ancestors did this. But they did it because they understood reciprocity. To give, to receive. Honoring our gatherers, hunters and gatherers, the knowledge, structures and systems that they had of connectivity. The 14th element that we talk about in Waiapa is the child. It is our responsibility to pass on purpose to that child. Respect of the earth, respect of all the elements, connection. Because that child is the creator. That child creates the next generation, and so forth. So when I say that I am a conduit of my ancestors, I am purely just passing through knowledge systems, passing through structures and conversation of reconnection. recalibrating systems that our children inherit. So when you're ready, open your eyes. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to having this yarn today. And I'm looking forward to these amazing presenters. I've been fanning is all. I've been checking is all out, and I will say, Jacinta, big fanboy here for the work that you do on the ABC. So thank you so much for joining me in that little visualization.
Jamie, I think I will just say on behalf of everybody who had the absolute honour of experiencing that, thank you so much for centering us and bringing us so beautifully to country and to land so that we can have this conversation in the way that we hope to this afternoon. You're an absolute treasure and we thank you. And I look forward to hearing some of your perspectives as we grow this conversation today. We'd love your questions as well. So don't be shy. All questions are good questions. I'm going to be proof of that because I am, I'm your special friend who's just facilitating on behalf of the people. But we are going to be delving in beautifully deeply, as you heard. Let's start with you, Catherine. Are you ready to kick off this conversation with us?
I think so.
I know after that beautiful beginning. I'd love to hear actually about your research and what you think makes connection to nature impactful for us, both as an individual, but then more broadly in community connection too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jacinta, and thanks, Jamie. It was wonderful. I was having a really big picture engagement with Wurundjeri country where I am at the moment, and I'm really grateful to you for leading us through that. So my research is about people's connections with the natural world, and I mainly do that through a psychological lens. And I guess it's important to say, what do I mean by nature? So when I think about nature, it means different things to different people. I think about plants and animals and the places that we share with them, and that can be in our home or out somewhere in a remote bit of forest. A lot of my work is thinking about the ways that we think and feel and act towards nature, and that includes understanding concern or lack of about ecological loss and climate change. But I'm really interested too in how places and plants and animals change us. I think it's really important that when we think about our relationships with the natural world, we think about them as a relationship. It's mutual influencing and it's complex because of that. What makes it impactful for us was your second part of your question. That's really big question. It's really multi-layered. And so I guess as a starting place, I'd say it starts with our material interdependence. We connect with nature to survive. That's a starting point. But I think too, impact comes through the experiences that we have, the experience of restoration or being strengthened in our capacities by spending time in the natural world, whether that's building up our strength as we hike or lift timber or whatever it is, or whether it's building our creative capacity to solve problems as our mind is restored. I think too, if we can just continue through the layers, for lots of people, spending time in nature is a way of participating in the traditions of our families and our cultures. As Jamie says, we all have special places and that's part of our story and our connection. And I think linked to that, the impact of connecting with nature comes through understanding our moral responsibilities to the rest of the natural world. So it's a way of living out our values and it's a way of belonging in this bigger picture.
Can you tell me a little bit about, in terms of that research, how you're looking into that? How are you seeing the impacts that nature has on our lived experience?
So how are we doing that? So there is now a big body of research which explores relationships between humans and nature from many different angles, and I'm obviously interested in the psychological aspects of that. So when we want to explore psychological impacts or changes that are associated with being in nature, we do interviews with people to understand how they describe their experiences. We do experiments where we invite people to spend time in natural environments or looking at images of environments and look at how they react to that. We might look at their attention or their mood or so forth. So there is now a pretty large evidence base around the kinds of impacts that we experience in natural environments. So studies have shown that spending time in natural environments can improve our attention, our ability to concentrate in a more sustained way, can be boosted by being in a natural environment, can certainly improve our mood, and particularly reducing negative feelings like being angry, for example. Being in a natural environment can reduce our tendency to ruminate, so that kind of persistent worrying over things in an unhelpful way that many of us have fun with, can be reduced by being in natural environments. And there's also evidence that this flows onto, like, I guess, broader functional things like work performance, even things like the likelihood that we're going to help other people is kind of underpinned by these things. So when I think about spending time in the natural world, I do think about it as really powerful in terms of the conversation we're having here about climate and climate anxiety. I think it can help us at an individual level, but it can also strengthen some of those capacities that are important to us working collectively to address climate change.
We're going to explore that further, that interconnection that's also required. I see Katie nodding so furiously that her head might fall off. So I might go to you, Katie, because what's really interesting about what Catherine brought up was the way that we can regulate emotionally. We're often told that we need to, manage or beat our anxiety. But can you tell us about your research? Because why anxiety might actually be an appropriate response to crisis, and what can anxiety help us do?
Yeah, thanks, Jacinta. And I'm sure, everyone can sort of resonate with the idea that maybe it's difficult to feel anxious after Jamie's wonderful meditation practice just now. So I personally feel incredibly connected to the Wurundjeri land that I'm on at the moment. So thank you very much again, Jamie. That said, of course, I think many people would also say that anxiety and feeling anxious is quite a natural and maybe rational response to what's going on in the world at large at the moment. We've certainly had a very tumultuous start to 2022. And I think that if that's the way that people feel, then it is very natural, and certainly you're not alone if you do feel that way. The way that affective scientists typically think about emotions is that they are functional, they have a use, they can be used by us or helped to use it by other people in order to kind of alert us to things in our environment that we might need to pay attention to. Or they can, in the case of anxiety, for example, fuel our behavior. We can kind of harness that feeling of energy that comes along with anxiety and maybe turn it into some more functional or positive responses to these negative events. So anxiety isn't necessarily something that we need to get rid of completely, even though it might feel a little bit better for us to do so. Sometimes if we can use that kind of emotion as fuel, it can end up being quite beneficial for ourselves or for others. Now, of course, if anxiety gets to be, at problematic levels or impacting on our lives in really detrimental and negative ways, that's when we might want to intervene and really make sure that we're not necessarily having that emotion rule our lives in the way that we might always think about it. But I would say that anxiety isn't always necessarily a bad thing.
I guess I would not be alone in saying that my climate anxiety is probably at a less than helpful place, that place where you get to where you feel overwhelmed and that you do not have any agency at a grand scale. So you've also done some research into those different interventions to help combat that level of anxiety, the climate change anxiety. Can you describe your research and some of those interventions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've recently been looking into this with an interdisciplinary team that several people here are involved in. And what we've done is try to look at the literature on interventions to deal with climate change anxiety from a bigger picture perspective than just the individual, which I think is really relevant to a lot of the things that we've already been touching on in terms of this connectedness to others and connectedness to nature. So when we look at the impact of climate change anxiety interventions, they don't always just have an impact on how we personally feel as individuals. They can impact on a number of different outcomes. So how socially connected we feel to other people around us and that sense of social cohesion. And also, of course, they can have an impact on our environmental action and the degree to which we're acting on the environment's behalf in order to create more positive attitudes and behaviors around nature. So what we've done is kind of synthesize that into a framework and a way of understanding the literature that goes beyond the effects of these interventions on the individual and looks at it from this slightly bigger picture perspective. And what we've found is that some interventions are very beneficial for individuals and perhaps less so for people's connection to nature or desire to, for example, engage in activism or volunteering to address those issues. Whereas some interventions can really have those benefits for the individual alongside these really exciting benefits for helping us feel more socially connected with others and helping us feel more connected to the environment. And as I'm sure everyone can appreciate, that's kind of where we want to get to, because if we're ever going to address climate change as a massive problem facing society, we need to act together as one. So we need to move beyond this lens of me as an individual to consider we as a whole.
So what is the difference between those interventions that work far more at connecting us to that bigger story and that bigger community?
I think it's really about the centering of the social group as a way of delivering those interventions. So certain interventions that focus on, for example, clinical therapies, which might be very appropriate for someone who, has clinical levels of anxiety that do need to be addressed in a therapy session. However, those quite individualized treatments don't necessarily do this work of connecting us to other people. They can do, often if they're done in group settings, for example, but practices that really encourage us to either connect with others through activism groups or connect to others mentally through, for example, the meditation practice that we've just been through. We can also connect to others sort of in our own hearts and minds as well. So those are really, I think, the interventions that we should be looking at to kind of get this broader range of benefits beyond individual anxiety reduction.
I look forward to furthering these ideas as this conversation evolves today. Thank you so much for that good idea of the work that you're doing and how it will connect with some of the other people, including Tejapala. Lovely to have you join us as well. Firstly, I'd love you to sort of place us with you and the work that you do.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here. The work that I do, I'm an ordained Buddhist in the Triratna Buddhist order, and I work for the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. We're multi-faith, as you mentioned, and we're trying to show that people of a wide range of faith traditions want bold and urgent action on the climate, and that is something which goes back into people's really deepest values, which, depending on the tradition, go back a very long way indeed. And so that's my work. My work is to mobilise religious communities around the country. At the moment, in the lead up to the federal election, we're asking faith communities to put a banner up outside of their church or other place of worship that says, usually links it to the environment, to their faith tradition, saying something like protect creation. And then it says, it's got our key message, which is bold climate action by 2030, starting now, to try and shift the debate away from 2050, which is where the debate was last year for a while, and onto the much more immediate term. And we're asking faith communities to, hold vigils outside of key MPs' offices and to meet with their members of parliament as well as we get close to the election. We've been working on other campaigns for some time, the Adani mine campaign. We've got quite a lot of work going on in divestment amongst religious communities as well.
It's a really interesting, it seems like an obvious intersection, faith and caring for the climate. Would you agree that it is, or is there a step that each faith needs to take in terms of aligning behaviours that have been so traditional, I suppose, in with action around climate change?
Well, it varies a lot from one faith tradition to another. And I could write there's a whole stand-up comedy routine I could write about how each one stacks up, which will never see the light of day. But I guess some broad comments. People often don't think about religious communities. They think think religious communities and climate change. They think about the conservative American right. That's a very, very small part of the picture worldwide. Most people of different faiths do feel strongly one way or the other. Probably the single most compelling document I think any religious communities put out is Pope Francis's Laudato Si that he put out in 2015. Astonishing piece of writing. I mean, very different from secular writing on the environment, which is very dry and very kind of measured. It's straight from the heart and straight to the guts. So it's very interesting when religious communities do get motivated. Boy, do they get motivated.
I think that probably leads me on to my next question for you, which is kind of your personal journey from into activism, support, also how that has worked for you individually, how you in faith, how that's actually, grown your sense of self and purpose.
Sorry, I have to respond to one part of the question, which is a sense of self from a Buddhist.
You're Buddhist. You're not there's no self.
That's not necessarily an entirely.
Well done.
Okay, so just leaving that aside, the whole cause of suffering, according to the Buddha, I guess I worked years ago in grassroots activism, and then I spent years either exploring the Buddhist community and Buddhist practice, but also then worked for quite a long time in sort of fairly conventional sustainability work, energy efficiency and water efficiency and stuff like that. And the only metaphor I've got for that was that in the face of what was the urgency of the climate change, by about 2012, I was starting to feel as if, imagine I was someone like a public health administrator who had the funding to maybe have hospitals for 5% of the population. And at a certain point, I needed to just go out there and just try and get some more money, try and shift the goalposts, try and actually just make the whole range of action a lot bigger. And so when I started working for the organisation I work for now, back in 2017, it was mostly a sense of relief that I was able to do something actually meaningful and to really push decision makers rather than just accept the parameters of what they were already laying out, which was almost universally hopeless, in Australia at least.
What about then directly that intersection of Buddhism and climate action?
Oh, sure.
How has that been your experience?
Well, it goes all the way back to 1996 when I first I kind of came across Buddhism and what I see as the truth of what the Buddha taught, and first really had my eyes open to the reality of the climate situation, both in the same year. And so there became this journey of trying to understand the relationship between the two and trying to motivate some of my fellow Buddhists, some of whom were not that easy to motivate, but also to gradually, because I sort of started as an activist before I was a Buddhist, to start to see the relationship between the state of mind that I was speaking and acting out of and the consequences that I was having in the world around me. That's the main thing that interests me now, is that the relationship, that two-way street between my state of mind and the world around me, and the world around me and my state of mind. And I don't think that's something which is particularly seriously explored in the climate activist movement very much. Meditation is seen as something to kind of lower the anxiety levels and that's it, rather than something fundamental, because you actually get to even be aware of your state of mind in the first place.
It's so interesting how that reflects what Catherine and Katie have said through their research as well, that connection, and then how it motivates this greater experience of connection as whole. And as well, of course, how we had that experience moments ago with Jamie. Thank you very much for your initial placement of your work. We really appreciate it. We'll continue. All the questions that are coming through as well from the audience are fascinating and will be wonderful to throw at our panelists once we finish the kind of first part of this conversation. But Jamie, so exciting to come back and to hear you speak again. I love your moves. They're very good. I'd love to hear more. Oh, hang on, you got to go off mute. Yeah, technical business. Are you there?
Sorry.
I want to know.
I must have Italian heritage somewhere because I speak with my hands a lot. we are a hand-speaking culture.
I love it. It's the best. I will say to you with my hands, I want to know about your experiences. You gave us a little bit of that insight at the start, but I'd love to hear more about establishing the practice of Wayapa work. And we felt that connection that you created for us in that session, but how, I guess, you came to develop that and that process of coming to that.
Yeah, look, it's I'm loving these yarns and the different perspectives. You know, for me, it was really about, well, looking at, you know, ancient practices all around the globe. And one of the things for me that was missing from the narrative, was missing from the conversation. Remember one day Sarah took me to the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival in Melbourne. I walked into the convention centre in Melbourne and this massive sign, Mind, Body, Spirit, Wellbeing for you. And I was like, oh, for me, deadly, that's great. But I was like, hang on, it's missing an important word there. And Sarah's like, what's that? I said, well, that's the earth. Because if the earth isn't well, you won't have a healthy mind, body, or spirit. And I walked into the centre, 500 stall holders from all over the world talking about mind, body, and spirit well-being. Not one person was talking about looking after the planet. And I was like, well, I think that's the missing link here. You know, like we've got to get reconnected back to focusing on understanding that sustainability is important. So through, you know, if I can get people visualizing their special place and looking after it and understanding that everyone's special place is connected, if I can get people moving like the environment, they're more likely to want to connect to it. But the other thing I think that's missing from this is intergenerational well-being. We all sit here in the luxury that our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years looked after the environment. And we have a purpose. So if I can get people to connect to the environment, and when I say connect to it, what's your favourite tree? What's your favourite, you know, look, I'm looking at them parrots out there. I'm looking at that wallaby just over here. I'm lucky to live on country. You know, I know down in the river there's eels and fish swimming in the water. You know, if I can do something as a steward of reciprocity, of mindfulness, then we'll be, you know, the earth will be a little bit better. As men, I like, you know, in all love and respect to I've got families that LGBTQIA, but as men, we're roughly 50% of the population, but guess what? We're about 90% of the problem of you know, of looking after the planet, because we're so disconnected. And obviously the men here are amazing and we're doing our little bit, but there's another, you know, 87.9% of the community that are not. And I have this conversation every day. And what I love about Wayapa is it takes me into places where I talk to men in their responsibility. And when I say that, we do a lot of work in the prisons with connecting men in the prisons to earth, and I understand that, you know, on lots of different levels. So the concrete, the bars are all made from Mother Earth. So they're basically encased in Mother Earth. But it's an unnatural setting. They need to be in nature. They need to be back into the community, their families. So hunters and gatherers. So when Waiapa gets connected to people, you know, those men, I thought they would be the most disconnected people that I have this yarn with, but they're not. I did a workshop, quick story, did a workshop with a group of men in the city one time, 30th floor, I'll call it as it is, you know, white corporate males, suits, and that must have been NAIDOC week, and they were just so disconnected that, you know, I'd take their phones off and put them in a little box, say, no, take, you know, and just one guy goes to me, he's about 25, and he goes to me halfway through the yarn, he goes, I don't care, Jamie, I'm not going to be here. And I went, wow, that's a powerful statement to make, my friend. Let's unpack that. And I said, okay, what do you mean? Oh, he goes, I'm not going to have, you know, I'm not going to be here. I said, well, what about your kids? And he goes, I'm not going to have kids. I'm just going to drive my Ferrari, wear my Armani suits and go to Ibiza, just travel around the world. I'm like, oh my goodness. Anyway, Bob, who walked in with him, they were talking about a golf game that they had on the weekend. And I said, Bob, have you got kids? Bob's about 55. He goes, yeah, I've got 2 kids. You got grandkids, Bob? Yeah, got 2 grandkids. Great-grandkids? He goes, no. Nah. I said, got great-grandkids? He goes, no. And he goes, I said, but anyway, he doesn't care about your kids, your great-grandkids. And this young guy goes, hey, I never said that. And Bob goes, yes, you did. Yes, you did. By not caring for the environment, you're not caring about my generations. So that connection of purpose, again, was about, wow, it was a light bulb moment for this young guy. And he goes, and he dismissed it. Again, no judgment on his life decisions, but he goes, well, fine, then I'll buy a keep cup. In my mind, I was like, does your Ferrari have a keep cup holder? I don't know, but for him though, there was a light globe that goes off. Bob was like looking at him going, hang on, you need to start taking care of the planet. So when we start to connect to purpose for intergenerational well-being, I think that there's that bigger conversation that can be had and shared. And what we do in Waiapa is we don't judge people on their journeys. You know, if you just buy a keep cup for the rest of your life, that's better than not buying a keep cup. Because I think as humans, we don't like to be judged. We don't like to be told what to do. You know, look, Adani, you know, what happened with Bob Brown driving up all those cars to Queensland. Everyone over in Queensland's like, Bob Brown, don't drive your cars up here, you big environmentalist, you know, you're destroying the planet with your, it's like, again, judgment. You know, we talk about encouraging and influencing change. And it may not be fast enough, or it may be fast enough. Who knows? We might not be here. Cockroaches will evolve, grow long legs and arms. They'll be driving the electric cars around going, they had their chance. They had their chance. And I hope that it doesn't get to that. But through Earth Connection, I think that if I can get people embodying the environment to understand that we're not separate from it, we are one. And, you know, they're more likely to have a relationship, not just from, you know, their own perspective, but from the perspective of generations that come after us. So,
Jamie, it's incredible to hear that alongside, you know, this wonderful education, you know, there is also this great compassion and non-judgmental perspective. I think that grace is incredible when we consider your deep felt understanding of suffering of country. How does Waiapa respond to that, knowing deeply that that Ferrari and the man driving it is responsible for potentially the suffering of country?
Oh, look, 100%. And I don't know his journey or his history that got him to where he was. You know, we talk about wants and needs. Environmentalists go, hang on, you can't say that when I say, hang on, I'm not actually anti-logging and I'm not anti-mining. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? I'm like, well, use check. You know, this book's made from wood from paper and this phone's made from minerals from a mine. What I'm anti is the destruction of biospheres and ecologies and not that those resources not taken respectfully, you know. So, you know, when I say that, I say it that we need to, you know, stop just taking things for absolute profit and only about necessity, because this is the world we live in. This is the harsh reality. And to me, this is how I get change. When I've got blokes, I live in a small timber industry town here. You know, I've got guys going, oh, so what, you're a greenie now? So you're a hippie? And I'm like, no, I'm just a bloke who wants to look after this planet for generations to come. And I actually have an understanding of biodiversity and the necessity for balance. And, you know, I sit down and have a beer with them and they go, oh, right, okay, well, what can I do? And I go, oh, I said, well, no, you tell me what you can do. You know, yeah, you're still wearing the same jeans from the 80s. You still got acid wash jeans on. You're still wearing Adidas Roams. You know, you haven't had a shave for, you know, 17 years. You're not wasting razor blades, you know, like, but what can you do? And this is the journey of conversation, of connection, because unfortunately we're in the situation that we are because of disconnection and disconnection from purpose, which is about doing what we can do. And I think that, you know, imagine, you know, like I'm preaching the converted today and I love it, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's not the converted that I need to talk to. It's, you know, it's people who are not voting for the right governments or not supporting industries that are good for the planet. So, you know, this is the yarn that Way Upper provides. It's, you know, it's all touchy-feely and deadly meditations, but it's real conversation and getting people engaged, in real life stuff.
I want to hang out with you every single day, Jamie. That is just so interesting. And it leads us on, actually, that non-judgmental aspect, I think, is a really crucial, key and fascinating place that you've taken us. Catherine, for you, contemplative practices often talk about being non-judgmental, about our experiences during meditative practices. How do we engage in nature in a non-evaluative way? What does that mean actually in practice?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I have to say that Jamie's reflections have made me think about the question in a totally different way than I did before I was preparing. And, you know, I guess what I'm really taking from Jamie is that, you know, that sense of connection, not just non-judgmental to the place we are, but non-judgmental to the people that are connected to this place. And that's really striking to me and something I want to think about a little bit more. When I, you know, I've been studying human relationships with nature for a long time, and I have to say it's only recently that I've started thinking about this in the context of contemplative practices. So this kind of framing of it is really, really also very interesting and helpful to me. And one of the things that my research group has been thinking about for a long time is we have to make the assumption that just any time spent in a natural environment is good for us. You know, it just is. And I don't think that's always the case. And I think what we need to recognize is there are different outcomes from different kinds of experiences, and that there's different kinds of ways of engaging with nature, different ways of paying attention, for example, can make a difference to the kind of outcomes that we have. And being non-judgmental is a really interesting one in terms of the outcomes that we might experience. So if you think about, you know, there's a little park that I walk around probably, you know, 3 or 4 times a week just out near my house. Some days I walk through that park and my head is just full of work, and I'm not noticing anything that's going on. Some days I walk around that park and I'm thinking, there's dog poop on the ground, the litter bins are overflowing, there's a rotten naughty dog that's, you know, annoying me, and, you know, I'm kind of getting cross with the experience. Some days, more positively, I'm walking around that park and I'm looking in all the trees trying to work out where the tawny frogmouths are roosting today. In all of those experiences, I'm focused and I'm judging. I'm really kind of processing at a high level what's going on in that environment. But there are other times when I'm in that park where my frame of reference is really different. I might walk around that park and my mind is drifting. You know, I'm noticing the birds, I'm feeling the wind in my ears, I'm, you know, sensing the cool air on my skin. I see a happy dog, I think about how my mum is. I ponder what I ate for lunch. I see some kids running around on bikes. My thoughts are being prompted by what that place offers me. But I'm not getting involved in any of those thoughts. I'm also drifting across, you know, memories and that place itself. That kind of experience is one that I would say is kind of non-judgmental. My mind is drifting. My colleagues and I think about this as a kind of constructive, intentional mind wandering, shifting between being softly captured by what this place brings to us, but also letting our mind run over memories and other thoughts. That's one way that I think in practice it looks to be non-judgmental in a natural place, but there are lots of different ways that it might look. You know, for example, some researchers have observed the experience of flow. If you might have heard that term of flow in an environment, it often occurs when we're doing something that's pretty challenging, maybe something like rock climbing. I always think it's a good example to think about. And it's where our skill just meets the task, just meets the challenge that we're presented with. And for a time, we're totally focused on that activity and that rock and that rope, our body, the air, it's all one. We're not judging because we are so absorbed in that moment. That would be another example. And then another idea that our research team is thinking about at the moment is mindful engagement with nature. So that's where we might have that kind of heightened sensitivity to, you know, the taste and the smells and the sights of the natural world around us. But our thoughts are also characterized by what mindfulness scholars might call decentering and non-reactivity. And in practice, that might be that feeling of just feeling at one with the natural world, like we are connected. There's not a distinction. I am there. Or it might be perceiving something unpleasant. Maybe that's the noise of the traffic on a nearby road, but accepting it, maybe feeling a little bit curious about it, not judging it. So I think that's kind of gives you a sense of some of the different ways that we might be in a natural world without judging it, and that might offer us particular kind of benefits, including, I think, strengthening our capacity to connect with the natural world and with others, I think, responding to what Jamie's talked about.
Fantastic, and really wonderful to hear the diversity of that experience of non-judgmental engagement, not just with the people who inhabit, which has been a wonderful provocation from Jamie today, but also the land and the country itself. Katie, for you, I'd love to hear a case study to help us sort of get a better idea of how you were talking about those interventions and how different ones have different effects. I'm going to give you an example. We've got two people interested in reducing climate anxiety. You mentioned it happens in clinic. It also happens potentially through activism. How might these different people approach anxiety? And what can we actually learn from both approaches? Can they speak to each other in some way?
Yeah, thanks. And can I say I'm learning so much from all of the other panelists about ways of approaching this. And I'm sort of mentally noting some of those practices down to try for myself on my walk home. Thanks, Catherine. I think for the way that we approach the effects of climate change anxiety interventions, as I said before, is kind of moving beyond this sort of central focus on the individual and moving to these kind of considerations of social impacts and environmental impacts as well. And we don't necessarily privilege any one of those different needs, be they, you know, personal, social, or environmental. So as Jamie would say, you know, no judgment, how people want to kind of prioritize those different things. But for example, often, you know, in the clinical space, people are prioritizing individual needs of emotional well-being and want to like reduce those feelings of anxiety on a personal level, for example, whereas an activist might be much more focused on the environmental level. How can we get people acting in ways that's going to be beneficial for the environment and tackle some of these issues? Both of those are very valid approaches to the same issue, but have a different perspective when it comes to how we personally feel. So an activist might actually want to, for example, preserve or even increase people's feeling of climate change anxiety, because they might think, well, if people feel anxious about this, they're more likely to act in line. The way that we would sort of think about it is that we need to consider all of those needs in balance with one another. So we need to have our personal emotional needs met and not be sort of overwhelmed. This is where I know we already have some people in the chat sort of discussing burnout. And I think that's a really big issue and problem among many activist communities, when the focus is solely on environmental action and how we need to do more in that space, if it doesn't necessarily come along with nurturing people's emotional needs alongside that action. And also, of course, focusing on the sort of social group and our relationships with other people and how we can maybe leverage those in order to get both the environmental outcomes we want and also the personal emotional needs that we want as well. So a theme, obviously, that's already come through, you know, a lot of what people are talking about is it's all about connection and our connection with other people, and using that for, you know, useful and good outcomes in these other domains that we might care about as well.
That's brilliant and really interesting to hear, you know, because we often think either or, but, you know, having a sense of where these different disciplines can assist us, I think, is really interesting. Tejapala, you'll be really pleased to know I've just come off a weekend of Buddhist retreat.
Oh, wow.
Look how chill I look.
I have no idea what the before photo looked like, so sorry.
It's like angry and stressed.
Oh, okay.
Sense of being. But I actually had a really beautiful experience in sitting in nature, and that energetic experience of nature that you can get, I suppose, in contemplation, where it's physical rather than mental. How has, for you in that tradition of Buddhism, how that contemplation helped that connection for you, and also connect as well and support climate action?
Well, first, I sort of want to respond to something that Katie was saying about the importance of socially motivated, socially geared, even meditation practices. There's a meditation practice called loving kindness meditation. There's a number of sub-variants of that, one of which is the compassion meditation. So you're bringing loving kindness and bringing people to mind who are suffering, perhaps including oneself. And it's said that the compassion meditation is particularly helpful in overcoming the problem of horrified, overwhelmed anxiety, which is the normal response to suffering. Yeah, that's what happens if you don't have essentially, if there isn't enough compassion built up in your consciousness, when you encounter suffering, you sort of get freaked out. And I think that's the state of mind of most of the climate movement, most of the time. And I think that's what I try to advocate for, is people learning that practice. But in particular, I'm not sure I agree that it's helpful to have a certain amount of anxiety or not. The way the Abhidharma, which is the Buddhist psychological tradition, would make the distinction between what the sort of pleasant or neutral or unpleasant feeling tone that you have on the one hand, and directionality of mind on the other, what you do with your mind. And in that sense, in terms of that second aspect, it's not so helpful to have any anxiety. There's energy in the anxiety, but that could be transformed into action with it that's completely devoid of anxiety. So that's a bit of a rambling answer to your question there, Jacinta. I'm sorry, but I mean, in terms of, you know, me and my own, where some of that's helped me is in meeting with particularly difficult decision makers. When I started this job, I had a couple of really serious challenges, and I didn't succeed in staying in anything like a healthy state of mind in two meetings I had. One was with the then Minister for the Environment, Josh Frydenberg, to talk about the Adani coal mine. And I went in with it was literally like the beginning of a joke. It was a rabbi, a bishop, a nun, and me. And the other meeting was, sorry?
And an economist.
No. We tried to keep it to the human realm. And the other meeting was three of us, meeting my boss and the Dean of St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Brisbane, meeting with the entire executive team of Adani Australia. That was a 2-hour meeting. And in both cases, I felt like I'd been a reasonably effective activist, but I was furious by the end of it. And I didn't like being furious, and I didn't think I was having a particularly good effect. And I think this practice helped me with is there is something we that to be too cosmic. I just mean that there's my frame of reference is to do with the realization of human potential. And I happen to think that a few more people practicing that will help us both with this climate crisis. And even if we fix it, we're probably going to have a few other problems, like, I don't know, the war in Ukraine or something like that to contend with. So having people who are really free from deeply reactive, angry states of mind, like I was in, it's got to be a good thing, regardless of what happens. And I guess I have, that Abhidharma tradition I was mentioning says that it lists out 11 traditional positive mental states. And it says the other 10 do not arise without some aspect of the 11th one being there. And that aspect is of confidence that in something higher. Now, that's not faith as usually thought about, but just the sense that, hey, there is a human value beyond getting and giving, and getting and pushing away what you don't want. Something more than that, than the most base experience of being a human. If you have confidence that there's something like that, and it's something that is worthwhile, and there are some people who are like that some of the time, that is the most fundamental. I think people talk about optimism in the climate movement. I don't think that's the most important state of mind to be cultivating. I think that sense of confidence that there is something meaningful to work towards, that's the most important state of mind.
Actually,
and it's helped me. My practice helped me with that.
Yeah, that's a really incredible sort of shift, just a slight shift, but a really significant one in terms of addressing some of that unhelpful anxiety. Jamie, I want to go to you again. Sorry, every time you bring me joy with those fingers.
I should have been a wiggle. Anyway.
I want to know, because you've had this really great experience working with young people, especially young men. I know from the young people that surround me, they are really cross, and perhaps, as Tejapala has mentioned, have lost a faith that, there is a greater purpose, perhaps, because of, being born into such dysfunction. How have you seen young people navigate the pressure of this ecological crisis?
Yeah, look, it's I'm sure we all have in some of their lives have contact with the younger folk, as we were once ourselves. I bring the conversation to my nephews and nieces who come home from a climate rally change meeting in the city with 3 pairs of shoes, a new phone, and I was like, come on, guys, and let's have a yarn about, our, and I come from, I come from poverty. There were times that there were no Christmases or presents under the tree, and, go out in the street and get ridiculed. And, being a child of the 70s and 80s, it was all about consumerism and materialism, right? And so, when I really reflect on my life, I had a lot, because I had one of the most amazing pieces of nature to immerse myself in, and, walk around in my red jackets, bare-chested, barefooted, and think I was Mowgli out of the Jungle Book and swing from trees and fish and hunt and gather from nature. And, you know, all my other friends had new Commodore 64s and Segas. And, you know, again, it's about the shift and change of what, you know, materialism and consumerism is. And I remember having this conversation with my son when he was about 15, and from the age of 12, we used to collect Nerf guns. We just did, you know, before I got understanding and woke to consumerism and materialism. And one day he come home and, you know, I was really thinking about Waiapa and really thinking about presents. And he goes, Dad, the new Nerf gun's out, let's go and buy it. I'm like, okay, do you need it or do you want it? And he was like, well, don't need it because I've got 8 of them up there in the bedroom, but I want it because that's the latest one out. I'm like, okay, well, you know, where's it going to go after you finish with it? You know, had this yarn, he did some chores, took him to the supermarket, to the big shopping centre, and I've got a coffee and I'm waiting for him to come back from buying the new Nerf gun. And he come back with a book. I said, oh, that's not a Nerf gun. He goes, no, you're right, Dad. I thought about it and actually definitely don't need it. Actually, I don't even want it. So again, the younger generation, I think, becoming more, you know, understanding that their consumerism and their materialism and their choices, and like us all, we have to make those changes. You know, young kids are buying, you know, well, not buying, they're downloading the app, good on you, and they're actually looking at the clothing companies that make their clothes now, you know, if they're good for the environment or not. You know, we've got, you know, young kids that I was with are like, oh, what do you buy, Nike or Adidas? And they're like, oh, you know, Nike's got the best range, but they're not good for the planet. And so they're sending emails, you know, to Nike's head office to say, I'm not buying your product today because it's not good for the planet. You know, so they're really engaging and starting to think about not just their connection to the environment, but their responsibility through their daily interactions, you know. And again, it's that because they've never been plated up, this narrative or this conversation, that you as an individual, you know, again, it's only one drop of water, said the ocean. You know, I say to people, get on 1 Million Women, you know, they're an amazing movement if you want to learn how to connect to the environment. So, you know, getting them aware of that every daily action that they do is having an impact. And that's empowering for them, because in a world where, you know, this whole concept of eco-anxiety, it's like, that was just never around when I grew up. Like we you know, it's amazing to think that our children are concerned so much that they're getting unwell from it. Is just mind-blowing to me. So, you know, when I can sit with a group of young people and say, this is what you can do, and this is how you can change. It is only one drop of water, said the ocean, in how we can make that change. And they feel empowered because they have the responsibility to what they go and buy or consume or support, or, you know, without that. And it's real, all the stuff that everyone's saying about burnouts and about, you know, anxiety and about stress and worry, and, you know, how we can actually, you know, funnel that. I don't know if Tony Robbins said it or not, but where focus goes, energy flows. So what am I focusing on here? You know, what am I channeling my daily life? And I think that with young people, you know, being more connected to the environment, they're more likely to make better decisions. So, you know, that's the work that we do in the space that we have, and being able to present Waiapa to, you know, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 100-year-olds, you know. So yeah, look, that's my take on it, and I'll be interested to hear other people's take on, especially with our children and kids. Yeah. I don't have grandkids yet, but hopefully one day. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really important way for us to go. We've got so many great questions coming from the audience. I might ask each of you one more question, and perhaps around some of that future looking, and then we'll go to those audience questions so that we ensure that this is a broad conversation, but I'm enjoying asking all these questions, quite frankly, and it's very kind of me to share, I have to say. I'll go to you first, Katie, because you've actually really done some thinking around how we work with children and youth around some of the climate anxiety. Have you got any tips in that space?
Sure. Yeah, I suppose what I would say to anyone who might be, experiencing climate anxiety, and that's true, as Jamie said, whatever your age, but I think is something that is really impacting on young people in particular at the moment, is just to remember that you're not alone. This isn't something that you only are feeling and that you only need to deal with personally, and that might sound trite or simplistic, but I think it's a really powerful way of looking at this. This is a collective experience that many of us, indeed most of us, are having. And so the more that we can think about this as something that actually connects us to others, not something that necessarily isolates us from others and is something that we only have to deal with on our own as a problem. So I think just reaching out to others, connecting to other people has massive benefits for our well-being and our personal emotional state. But to the degree that we can do that in an environmentally conscious way, it's also going to have all sorts of positive flow-on benefits for that environmental level of consideration as well. So I think staying socially connected and reaching out to others who might be experiencing the same thing is a really powerful way of dealing with that.
It's incredible that connection keeps coming through every single conversation in the various ways it does. Catherine, I'm going to ask you, it's almost like, a final wave of the flag for things that we can do in terms of the practicality and how your research works. You talked about walking around, your local park. Lots of people potentially with us today are living in urban areas. What are some of the just practical things that we can do to really have that feel that, our fingers are in the dirt? I worry about my kids not having enough of that.
Yeah, so I think even though, most of us live in cities, there are lots of opportunities to connect with nature in different ways. And that can be just seeking out a small area of nature and just really paying attention. I guess a bit of advice would be to look for a place that has some complexity, like some diversity, and but also makes sense to you and is comfortable to be in. Something that you can explore visually or through sound, for example. We can really expand our sense of connection through that. An example might be finding a really intricate plant, like succulents often have really complex structures that you can actually look at and engage in for quite a long time. We can also encounter nature in virtual ways. So films, podcasts, books can be powerful ways of helping us connect with nature, even if we are stuck in bed, if we're sick, for example, or in lockdown in our home in isolation. I think we can also just enrich our connection with nature by learning so my connection, for example, with the University of Melbourne and our Parkville campus has been really strengthened by learning about the connections of Wurundjeri people to this place, by learning about the creek that flows under the campus, by learning about the eels that still swim through that creek. Even though I'm walking around on a concrete surface above, I'm sensing those connections in that place, and it's enriching even that concrete experience. And of course, drawing on contemplative practices, as we've talked about today. Rose Macaulay is a PhD student in our research group, and she's leading research which is showing that the different ways that I talked about earlier of connecting with nature can support different outcomes in terms of mood, attention, but importantly, longer term connection with nature and potentially pro-environmental behaviour, so taking action on climate and other ecological crises.
That's wonderful. Everything I will implement this evening. I'm going to my succulents. Tejapala, I guess the same question goes to you in a way. Through your experience, your contemplative practices, what's something that you could share with all of us that you think, has been something that we could all use to make that connection that we've been speaking about?
Really simply, I think if Buddhism divides the human experience into body, speech, and mind, and practices of body, speech, and mind. So I would think in terms of compassion practices on those three levels. On the body level, what you physically do, just if you're not already, then getting more involved in the climate movement, just doing things that will help, and then I think particularly organising with others. On the speech level, trying to speak truthfully about the climate in a way that is still kind to the listener. That is a bit of a rare skill, I think. Sometimes the truth is used as something to bash people over the head with, or we avoid the truth because we don't want to be unkind. So being able to be truthful and kind at the same time takes a bit more thought and skill. I certainly think it's well worth the effort. And then on the mind level, learning the loving kindness meditation practice, and maybe joining with others who are interested in that and becoming part of a practice community, because particularly if they're involved in the climate movement, but not necessarily, because that's I think doing those sorts of practices with others gives another shift in perspective as well. There's a lot more I could say, but that's probably enough.
Well, it's never enough, but for today, with time, even though time is not real, I know that Tejapala and constructions and all of that, there is time upon us. Jamie, quickly with you too, I think one of the most resounding, I mean, there's been so much that you've said that we've all taken into our hearts, but your grace and compassion for those that don't share the same values of the environment is something that I've really, been quite impressed by. Any advice on how we deal with, which can be part of the anxiety, those that seem to not want to walk the same path?
Yeah, look, I think one of our Waiapa practitioners, Jazz, said to me one day, she said, "Uncle Jamie, our relationship with Mother Earth is the longest relationship we'll have in our whole life." And I was like, wow, that's pretty profound. That's it'll be longer than the relationship we have with our parents, and it'll be longer than the relationship we have with our children. And when I talk to blokes about this topic, again, like I said before, that the disconnected are just disconnected. And when I start having relationships with conversation with people, it's just about our purpose, as again, it's about connection. We've been saying that Waiapa is a Pekorong word for connection. It is connection, and it's about encouragement. And a lot of my mates, they find I'm a dichotomy to them, because they're like, hang on, but you're a great bloke, but you want to save the planet, and it's like, that's why I'm a great bloke. Yeah. And they go, there's this whole thing about if you don't think about saving the planet, you're some way different or soft or whatever. But so for me, this relationship of conversation of changing the narrative, I hunt, I fish, I save the planet. Come on, guys, let's get on board. This is where it's at, because that's the population that actually needs to be lifted and communicated with. I think that I am that linchpin. I'm that middle road of not totally left, not totally right. I'm in the middle, and I'm encouraging you to come this way, because the way isn't good for humanity. Come this way more. And so when I have these conversations with the uneducated, well, not even uneducated, they know what's going on. We know that there's a climate crisis, and they're just disconnected from that relationship. And yeah, I think that when like I said before, I love going to a climate rally, but that's not where it's going to be changes. I love going to B&S balls where all these people are just not even talking about this stuff, and I get to have a yarn to them about it. And they're the people that need convincing and changing and connecting. So, for me, that's where Waiapa's at. Is I'll meet you halfway, because I don't expect you to come all the way this way. go for it if you want to, but that's not, obviously, clearly that's not where the population is it? So, you know, for me, that's the connection.
Meet me in the middle. Beautiful, Jamie. We've got a couple of minutes to go. So I do want to get audience questions. So this is what we're going to call a lightning round. I don't know really what that is. I just made it up, but it means like super fast answers to very complex questions that don't deserve super fast answers. That I'd love to ask each of you one from the audience. Catherine, I'm going to go to you quickly. How can research, I think this is really interesting, researchers who focus on climate change, especially graduate and early career researchers, manage climate change anxiety and harness that stress for greater purposes?
Sorry, that was just a big sigh, which thankfully was off. Was muted. Look, I just feel like this is such a huge project and something that, you know, it's not just early career, but it's later career researchers are really grappling with. And I think, like Katie mentioned earlier, the importance of knowing we're not alone. And I think being able to talk about, as researchers, about the ecological anxiety and anger and grief that we're experiencing is a really, really important starting place, at least, and acknowledging that amongst you know, any communities, and that includes research communities, I think is just that's enough for lightning.
Beautiful, beautiful answer, Katie, as well for you. That there's heaps of focus at the moment on mental health. Governments are allocating funds both federally and locally. Are we seeing much of a link between that government spending on mental health around climate action and climate anxiety?
I'd love to have a more informed opinion about this than I do. I don't know of much work or even activism pressure that's being brought to bear on linking mental health funding to climate funding. I think that would be incredibly powerful and incredibly important to see climate change not only as a thing that's affecting the environment, but a thing that is affecting humans, which I think also relates to another question that was in the Q&A about, of course, humans are part of nature, so we can't you know, disentangle those two things. So I would love it if there was more, and I certainly encourage everyone to be vocal about that.
Jamie, that's the question for you, really. Someone has said, I've noticed that often people talk about humans and nature as separate things that interact. Is that part of the issue?
Absolutely. You know, that whole concept of the pyramid where we stand aloft of it, and, you know, our egos and our greed is definitely divisive from our relationship with the environment, and we are the environment. And that when that narrative gets talked about more and people understand that, you know, we're not separate from it, that we are a part of it. And, you know, I think COVID was a really telling factor in understanding. You know, we literally, Mother Earth said, right, you're sick, get into your rooms, get well. And guess what happened? Mother Nature just was like blossom and bloomed. And again, you know, we are nature, and we have a massive impact on nature, you know, as a species. And yeah, once we get that relationship aligned and imbalanced, we're going to be more centered, and I think more better for humanity for generations to come.
Absolutely wonderful. Tejapala, just really quickly, I've seen that you've answered the question in the comments, but someone was specifically asking about groups, contemplation groups that deal with this specifically, whether you know of any.
Yeah, well, I know of faith traditions. How contemplative they are is another question. Certainly, there are churches. I'll name names here. The Anglican Church outside of Sydney would be particularly strong on the climate. The Uniting Church is particularly strong pretty much wherever you go, just not North Queensland. And I think the Buddhist tradition generally, there's Buddhists tend to divide into people who think that it's all about sitting on the cushion, and those who are radical as you can possibly imagine, and are prepared to go out and get arrested, and are really willing to get involved in teaching meditation to activists. So if you go to a Buddhist centre, I go to the Melbourne Buddhist Centre in Brunswick, just have a look around and see if you can find those people, because they'll probably be there.
It's so good. I cannot thank you all enough. We've got to wrap up. I don't know what happens. Does it blow up? I'm not sure. It's 1:30. It's time for everyone to get back to the world. But thank you so much to our 4 panelists, Tejapala, Katie, Jamie, and Catherine. Honestly, your insights and how they work together, your personal stories, have really helped, I think, well, me. I'm the only one here, but there's a whole lot of us listening today that this has been a really important way for us to have this conversation. Thank you so much to the Contemplative Studies Centre for including this topic as part of the Contemplation Conversation series. How good is it? And most importantly, thank you to you, our audience, in this virtual reality for your continued support. I guess we all disappear, but Jamie, we're going to stay in our imaginations, connected to the world and to each other. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.